So in the last video, we were looking at the benefits of Azure Resource Manager, or why we should use or consider using the Azure Resource Manager, right? Uh, and one of the few key things was that it provides a consistent way to manage, deploy, or update solutions. And we could use tags, which could uh, logically group resources, and which will also help in billing. So now I'm going to review the Azure resource terminology. Um, all right, so basically you have a list of terms here. So let's start with a resource. So what is a resource? So resource is any manageable item that is available through Azure. So you could have like a virtual machine could be considered a resource, a storage account. You could have, and again, storage accounts can be of different types, like blob storage, file storage, queue, um, table. There's a separate module only for managing storage accounts. So you can look into that later. But yeah, so then you have a web app, database, virtual network. So any manageable item, right? Could be considered a resource, and obviously it's not limited to this, and you have many more. And then you have a resource group. So a resource group is a container that holds related resources for an Azure solution. The resource group can indicate or include all the resources for the solution, or or only those resources that you want to manage as a group. You decide how you want to allocate resources to resource groups based on what makes sense or the most sense for organization. So you can basically organize it whatever way you want to, right? Doesn't have to be a certain way, but it's a container where you can like hold resources, right? Uh, Resources, you add resources to a resource group, and that's the main uh, uh, objective or of why we have resource groups is to manage resources. So okay, so then you have a resource provider, which is a service that supplies the resources you can deploy and manage them through the resource manager, right? Azure Resource Manager. So it's a service. um, so basically identifying, um, it supplies the resources that you deploy. So each resource provider offers operations for working with resources that are deployed, and some common resource providers are Microsoft.Compute, which supplies the virtual machine resource, and then you have Microsoft.Storage, which supplies the storage account resource, and Microsoft.Web, which supplies resources related to web apps. So obviously you have many different kinds of resource providers which provide or supply the resources required for the deployment of said resources, right, through the resource manager, right from virtual machines to um, web apps, storage accounts. So each of them have their own resource providers. And then you have template. So a template is a JSON, or it's also known as a JavaScript object notation file that defines one or more resources to deploy to a resource group. It also defines the dependencies between the delayed resources, and the template can be used to deploy the resources consistently and repeatedly. And let's again, we are going the same theme here, in terms of like what is on last unit, about deployment, and everything is deployed in the same state, so you don't need to worry about uh, things not being deployed. Some things are missing in the checklist or whatnot. And then you have a declarative syntax, which is that lets you state, like, here is what I intend to create, right? That's what we're talking about. This is what I want to do. This is exactly what I want to do. You're having to write the sequence of programming commands to create it, right? You don't need to write commands. You don't need to do anything. So you just need to follow how the template is written, and then and then work within that construct, right? So the resource manager template is an example of a declarative syntax. In the file, you define the properties for the infrastructure to deploy to Azure. Okay, and now we're talking about resource providers, which we have dealt a little bit in before. So, which is basically that a resource provider provides or supplies resources that are needed to deploy a resource, right? So you could have resource providers for, I mean, you could have it for any resource. You could have it for a storage account. You could have it for a virtual machine. You could have it for a web app. Um, so uh, yeah, so each resource provider offers a set of resources and operations for working with an Azure service. For example, if you wanted to store keys and secrets, you would uh, work with the Microsoft.Key Vault um, resource provider. And and this is talking about storing, and which in turn will lead to a storage account, right? So this resource provider offers a resource type called vaults for creating the key vault, right? So the name of a resource type is in the format resource slash provider slash resource hyphen provider slash resource type. So, for example, the key vault type is Microsoft.Key Vault, which is the resource provider, slash vault, which is the resource type. And note, so before deploying your resources, like the vault or the storage account, web app, uh, virtual machine, anything. So before deploying your resources, you should gain an understanding of the available um, resource providers, right? So you need to know what kind of resource providers are there for the resource that you want to deploy, right? So for instance, if you want to deploy a virtual machine, you need to know what are the resource providers. So one of them, which you know, um, and that we discussed previously, for a virtual machine would be Microsoft.Compute, right? Which is a resource provider for a virtual machine. Um, so we need to know that, and knowing the names of resource providers and resources helps you define resources you want to deploy to Azure, right? And that's why, like, while using the declarative template, we would be specifying the resource providers and the resource type, right? We need to do that. So also, you need to know the valid locations and API versions for each resource type. Uh, in terms of where they're located, right, and the API versions. So I'll be mentioning some of the key items and in the description, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video where I'll be creating resource groups. So until then, see you next time.